I always thought I knew my wife. After 40 years together, through every triumph and hardship, I believed there were no secrets between us. But I was wrong. It started on a quiet Sunday evening. The air was heavy with the scent of rain from earlier that day, and the house was filled with the familiar hum of the television playing some old sitcom we had seen 100 times before. I sat in my recliner, reading through an old photo album, reminiscing about the early days of our marriage, our wedding, our first home, the vacations with our children. It was a life I had been proud of, a life I had always cherished. Then she spoke. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice trembling just enough for me to notice. I glanced up from the album, expecting something trivial, a forgotten bill, maybe a call from one of our kids. But the look in her eyes sent a chill through me. She was nervous, genuinely nervous. I closed the album and placed it on the coffee table. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath, folding her hands together in her lap. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at them as if searching for the right words. I felt my chest tighten. "You deserve the truth," she finally said. The truth? A strange, uneasy feeling crept over me. My mind raced through possibilities. Was she sick? Did she do something regrettable? My heart pounded against my ribs as I waited, every second stretching longer than it should have. She exhaled sharply, as though she had been holding her breath for years. And then, in the softest voice, she said something that made my entire body go cold. "I haven't been honest with you about us." A deep silence filled the room. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, the distant sound of rain against the window. The weight of her words pressed against me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the verge of losing everything. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked up at me, her eyes glistening with something between guilt and relief. "There are things I never told you. Things that—" Her voice broke, and she wiped her hands on her dress as if trying to shake off whatever fear was gripping her. I felt a strange mixture of emotions, confusion, dread, and an unshakable feeling that whatever she was about to tell me would change my entire world. "You have to understand," she said. "I never wanted to hurt you." The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. I gripped the arms of my chair, steadying myself. "Margaret," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "just tell me." And then, with a single sentence, she shattered everything I had ever known about our marriage. Margaret's lips trembled as she tried to form the words, but I could see it in her eyes. Whatever she was about to say had been weighing on her for years. Decades, maybe. She took a shaky breath. "There's something I've kept from you, for a very long time." My stomach knotted. A quiet, creeping dread settled over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had been her husband for 40 years. I knew her better than anyone. Or at least, I thought I did. I sat still, waiting, but she hesitated. She looked at her hands, twisting the edge of her sleeve between her fingers. Then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "I wasn't faithful to you, Leonard." The words rang in my ears, hollow and distant, like an echo in a vast, empty space. My hands clenched into fists against the armrests. The room felt unreal. The walls, the furniture, even Margaret herself, all of it blurred at the edges, as if I had stepped into some distorted version of my own life. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry. "Say that again," I finally managed. She looked at me with eyes that pleaded for understanding, but I wasn't sure I had any left in me. "It wasn't just once," she whispered. "It was over time." A sharp, twisting pain spread through my chest. It was an ache I had never felt before, not even when we lost our first child before birth, not even during the hardest times of our marriage. This was different. This was betrayal. I forced myself to breathe, to think. My mind scrambled for logic, for reason. "When?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Margaret's face crumpled. "It started in the early years of our marriage." The early years. The foundation of everything. My fingers dug into the chair's fabric as the realization set in. This wasn't a mistake from last year, or even a decade ago. This had been part of our marriage from the very beginning. The life I had cherished, the memories I had held so dear, all of it, tainted. "Who?" I croaked. My own voice felt foreign. Margaret hesitated again, and I could see it, the way she weighed whether telling me the full truth would destroy me entirely. I leaned forward, my body tense. "Who, Margaret?" She shut her eyes tightly, as if bracing for impact. And then she said it. "Robert." The air left my lungs. Robert. My best friend. My best man at our wedding. The man who held my newborn son before I did. The man who had sat at my dinner table for years, laughing, drinking, sharing stories like family. It felt like the ground beneath me had vanished, leaving me suspended in nothingness. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I said nothing. I just sat there, staring at the woman I had loved for 40 years, trying to understand how I had been blind for so long. How long? My voice was eerily calm, but inside, I was unraveling. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. On and off for years. Before he moved away, I wanted to stand up, to move, to do something, but I couldn't. My body felt frozen. My entire life had just been rewritten in a matter of seconds. I loved you, she continued, desperation creeping into her voice. I still do. But it was a mistake, Leonard. A terrible mistake. A mistake. A mistake that spanned years. A mistake that had sat across from me at countless family gatherings. A mistake that had been there through every milestone of my life. I felt sick. I closed my eyes, inhaled sharply, and tried to steady myself, but the weight of it was crushing. I needed time to think, to process. But deep down, I knew there was no coming back from this. And the worst part? I had no idea if this was the whole truth, or just the beginning. My whole body felt numb. I sat there, staring at Margaret, my wife of 40 years, the woman I had built a life with, and yet in this moment, she felt like a complete stranger. Robert, my best friend, the man I had trusted with everything. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make sense of it all, but instead, my voice came out eerily calm. Why are you telling me this now? Margaret wiped at her face, tears streaking down her cheeks. Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore, she whispered. I should have told you years ago, but I was terrified of losing you. I let out a bitter laugh, one that didn't feel like my own. You were terrified of losing me? I shook my head, the weight of her words crushing me. Margaret, you lost me the moment you chose him. She flinched at that, but I didn't care. 40 years. 40 years of marriage, of building a family, of growing old together. Was it all a lie? I thought back to the memories I cherished the most. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, the quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the porch. Was Robert in the background of all those moments, a shadow I never noticed? I couldn't breathe. I stood up, pacing the living room as my thoughts spiraled. Does he know? I asked suddenly, turning to face her. Does Robert know that you're telling me this? Margaret hesitated. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We haven't spoken in years. I scoffed. How convenient. She clasped her hands together, desperate. Leonard, please. I love you. I always have. I turned to her then, and for the first time in my life, I looked at her with nothing but emptiness. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Not after this. Margaret let out a small sob, her whole body shaking. But I didn't reach for her. I didn't comfort her. For once, I didn't care about her tears. I needed space. I needed to think. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out the front door, leaving behind the woman I had once thought was my forever. As I stepped into the cold night air, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. This was the end of everything I thought I knew about my own life. I don't remember how long I walked. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was a storm, thoughts clashing, memories unraveling, everything I believed in turning to dust. Robert, my best friend, my wife, the two people I trusted most had betrayed me. I kept replaying our years together, searching for signs I had missed. Had there been stolen glances between them? Had Robert ever seemed too comfortable in our home? Had Margaret hesitated before kissing me goodnight, knowing she had been with another man? The realization was suffocating. My entire life, 40 years, felt like a carefully crafted illusion, and I had been the fool who believed in it. I found myself at the park near our house, the same one where Margaret and I used to bring the kids when they were little. The swings creaked in the wind, the empty benches staring back at me like ghosts of the past. I sat down on one, dropping my face into my hands. I had given Margaret everything. My loyalty, my trust, my heart. And in return, she had given herself to someone else. For years. Not a one-time mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A choice, over and over again. The pain came in waves, but underneath it, something else was building. Something colder. Something I wasn't used to feeling. Resentment. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of a marriage that had been uneven for longer than I had realized. The way I had always been the one to compromise, the one to apologize first, the one to make sacrifices for the sake of us. Had she ever truly loved me? Or had I just been convenient? The thought made me sick. I sat in that park for hours, until the sky turned from deep navy to soft gray. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but I still couldn't bring myself to go home. Because home didn't feel like home anymore. But I had to face her. I had to look Margaret in the eye and decide what came next. When I finally walked back into the house, she was sitting in the same spot, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The moment she saw me, she stood up, her hands clasped together. Leonard, I held up a hand, and to my surprise, she stopped. Don't, I said. My voice was hoarse, but steady. Just don't. She took a step closer. Please, No. For the first time in our marriage, I saw something shift in her eyes. Fear. I had always been the calm one, the patient one, the husband who listened, who forgave. But now I felt like a stranger to myself. And so did she. I need you to answer something, I said, my voice cold. And I want the truth. All of it. Margaret swallowed hard, nodding. I stared at her, my chest rising and falling with each breath. How many? I asked. Her face crumpled. Leonard, please. How many? Silence. Then a whisper. More than just Robert. It was like my heart stopped beating. The floor beneath me might as well have cracked open. The world tilted, my vision blurred. I had braced myself for something terrible. But this was something else entirely. I took a step back, gripping the wall to steady myself. You mean to tell me that Robert wasn't the only one? Margaret shook her head rapidly. It wasn't like that. I didn't go looking for it, I swear. I laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. You didn't go looking for it? Margaret, how many times does someone accidentally fall into an affair? She flinched. It wasn't like that, she repeated, her voice breaking. But yes, there were others. Over the years. I stared at her, my mouth dry. How long? I managed to say. She hesitated. And that was my answer. Not a year. Not a few years. This had been happening throughout our marriage. I had been living a lie. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, my head spinning. I looked at her. This woman who had been my partner, my love, my everything. And all I could see was someone I no longer recognized. I had wasted 40 years of my life on a woman who had never truly been mine. And suddenly, I knew. I couldn't stay. I stood there, staring at her, feeling like I was outside my own body, watching this moment happen to someone else. My hands felt numb, my ears were ringing, and my chest was so tight it hurt to breathe. More than Robert. More than once. More than I could even comprehend. Say it again, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret wiped at her face, her breath shaking. Leonard, I'm so sorry. Say it. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I needed to hear it. I needed the words to register in my brain, because none of this felt real. She squeezed her eyes shut like she couldn't bear to see me, and then she said it. There were others. Something inside me shattered. My whole life had been a lie. I had been living in a marriage where I was the only one who had been faithful. The only one who had believed in us. The only one who had thought that what we built actually meant something. I wanted to scream. Instead, I exhaled, slow and controlled. Who? Margaret's hands clenched into fists. I don't want to hurt you more than I already have. I let out a hollow laugh. Margaret, that ship has sailed. Give me names. She hesitated. I took a step forward, staring into her tear-streaked face. You want forgiveness? I asked, my voice raw. Then give me the truth. All of it. For the first time in my life, I saw her hesitate in a way that terrified me. Like she was about to say something that would break me even more. And then, she did. There were 3, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Over the years. My stomach twisted. 3. Not counting Robert. I felt sick. My mind raced, trying to place the pieces together. Who? When? How had I never known? Who? I said again, but this time my voice was ice. She hesitated again, but then she finally spoke. The first was before we had kids. My throat tightened. That meant it was in the early years of our marriage. When I was working extra shifts, trying to build a future for us. When I was working 2 jobs, I said bitterly. Trying to give you the life you wanted. Margaret nodded, barely able to meet my eyes. I gritted my teeth. The second. She swallowed hard. When the kids were young. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. While I had been waking up in the middle of the night to rock our children back to sleep. While I had been working to keep food on the table, she had been sneaking around. And then, I realized something. The timing. The doubt that had been buried so deep in my heart, I had never let myself even entertain the thought. My voice dropped to a whisper. Were they mine? Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Leonard, how can you even ask that? I took a step back, running a hand through my hair, my breath shallow. How can I not? I shouted, my voice breaking. You have been lying to me for 40 years, Margaret. You just admitted to 3 affairs. Do you expect me to just assume you were careful? That I was never deceived in more ways than I already know? Tears poured down her face. I swear on my life. Leonard, our children are yours. I stared at her, searching for any sign of dishonesty, any hesitation. But even if she was telling the truth, I would never know for sure. I could get a DNA test. But did I even want to? Did I want to risk discovering that my children, my whole family, was built on even more deception than I already knew? I shook my head. And the third? Margaret took a shaky breath. It ended 10 years ago. 10 years. So while I had been planning for our retirement, dreaming about the years we would spend traveling and growing old together, she had been with someone else. It wasn't just betrayal. It was my entire life crumbling at my feet. I exhaled, feeling like my chest was going to cave in. Who was it? Margaret looked at me then, her lips trembling. I can't. I gave a sharp, humorless laugh. You can't? Margaret, after everything you've told me, you can't? She sucked in a breath, wiping at her face, and then she whispered a name. A name I knew. A name I trusted. And in that moment, something inside me turned to ice. Because this wasn't just betrayal. It was something much, much worse. My heart stopped the moment her lips formed the name. I heard it. I understood it. But my brain refused to accept it. It couldn't be. Say it again, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Margaret looked like she was about to collapse. Her body shook, her hands twisting together, but I needed to hear it. I needed to know I wasn't imagining things. She swallowed hard, then whispered it again. James. I felt the room spin. James. My brother. My own flesh and blood. A slow, creeping nausea crawled up my throat as the realization sank in. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a violation of everything I had ever believed in. James had always been there. From the moment we were kids, he had been my shadow, my closest family. And when Margaret and I got married, he had been part of that journey too. Holidays, birthdays, family trips. I thought back to the countless moments I had spent with him, never once suspecting a thing. Had it been in my house? Had they laughed behind my back? How many times had I unknowingly invited the man sleeping with my wife into my home, sat across from him at the dinner table, toasted with him on New Year's Eve? The room was too small. I couldn't breathe. I took a slow step back, then another. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me, but I forced myself to stay standing. Margaret took a hesitant step toward me. Leonard, please. It was. I held up a hand, and she stopped. Don't, I said, my voice hoarse. Just don't. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. I swear, it ended years ago. It was a mistake. I cut her off, my voice bitter. That's what you keep saying, Margaret. But mistakes don't last for years. Mistakes don't involve my own damn brother. She flinched, but said nothing. A deep, soul-crushing silence filled the room. I felt like I was floating outside of my own life, looking in from the outside. Everything was unraveling, thread by thread, faster than I could keep up. You have to understand, Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. I love you, I always have. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Do you even hear yourself? I gestured wildly around the room. You're standing in our house, confessing to years of infidelity, including with my own brother, and you want me to believe you love me. Tears ran freely down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head in disbelief. You never wanted to hurt me? I took a deep breath, trying to contain the storm raging inside me. Margaret, you destroyed me. I thought about everything I had sacrificed for this marriage. The sleepless nights, the years of hard work, the moments I put her happiness above my own. All for what? So she could betray me with the people closest to me? A bitter taste filled my mouth. I clenched my fists at my sides, my body trembling with the weight of it all. I needed space. I needed to think. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house. Margaret called after me, but I didn't stop. The moment I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. It felt sharp, grounding. For the first time in hours, I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I walked, block after block, my feet moving on their own. I barely noticed my surroundings, just the streetlights casting long shadows, the occasional car passing by, the distant hum of life moving forward while mine had just stopped. Somehow, I found myself in front of James's house. I stood there, staring at it, my chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. I could see the light on in his living room, could see the shadow of movement inside. My hands curled into fists. He had been my brother. He had been my family. And he had done this to me. I wanted to march up to that door and demand answers. I wanted to scream in his face, to ask him if he had ever felt guilty, if he had ever looked at me and thought, maybe I shouldn't do this to my own brother. But then a terrifying thought hit me. What if he didn't even regret it? What if he had been laughing at me all these years? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step back. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to be smart. I needed to figure out what came next. Because one thing was certain. I was done being the fool. I stood outside James's house, my breath fogging in the cold night air, my body tense with the weight of the truth. This was the man I had grown up with, the brother I had shared everything with, the person I had trusted more than anyone else in my life, except, of course, for Margaret. And they had both betrayed me. I clenched my fists, willing myself to calm down, but the rage burned hot in my veins. I had spent decades believing in a marriage that had never truly been mine, trusting a brother who had stabbed me in the back without hesitation. I wanted to confront him, to look him in the eye and ask him how he could do this to me. But a deep, sick feeling in my gut stopped me. What if he didn't regret it? What if he had no guilt, no shame? I wasn't sure I could handle that. I turned away from his house and walked. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stand still. My world had already collapsed, but I still felt like I was falling, spiraling into something I couldn't escape. After what felt like hours, I ended up back at home. Margaret was waiting. She sat on the couch, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. The moment she saw me, she straightened, her hands twisting together in her lap. I didn't speak right away. I just stood in the doorway, staring at her, wondering how I had missed it for so long. All the moments I had loved her, trusted her, fought for her, had they all been a lie? She looked at me, hesitated, then finally spoke. "Where did you go?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I let out a dry laugh. "Where did I go?" I shook my head. "Margaret, do you really think I'm in the mood for small talk?" She flinched, but didn't argue. I stepped further into the room, my eyes locked on her. "I need answers," I said, my voice low and steady. "All of them. No more excuses, no more, I didn't mean to hurt you. Just the truth." Margaret swallowed hard. "I already told you." "No," I cut her off. "You told me bits and pieces. You told me just enough to try and soften the blow. But I want all of it." She hesitated. I clenched my jaw. "Or would you rather I go straight to James and ask him?" That did it. She stiffened, her breathing shaky. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, my hands resting on the table between us. "Tell me how it started," I said. "With him." Margaret's face crumpled. "Leonard, please. Tell me." A long silence filled the room. Then, finally, she spoke. "It was a long time ago," she whispered. "More than 20 years. 20 years. I exhaled sharply, looking away. I had thought I was prepared to hear it, but nothing could have braced me for this. She kept talking, her voice weak, shaking. "It happened when you were traveling for work," she admitted. "You were gone for a few weeks, and I was lonely. James was around a lot, helping with the kids." My stomach churned. "I never planned for it to happen," she went on quickly. "But one night, after I put the kids to bed, we had a drink. One turned into two. And then—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I closed my eyes, inhaling through my nose. I had trusted her. I had trusted him. And while I had been working to provide for our family, she had been sneaking around with my own brother. I forced myself to focus. And after that, Margaret bit her lip. "It wasn't constant," she said. "It happened a few times. Then we stopped. But a few years later, it happened again." I shook my head, my hands curling into fists. "You expect me to believe you tried to stop? Margaret, you had an affair with my brother twice." Tears streamed down her face. I know, and I hate myself for it." I scoffed. "Yeah? Must be real tough for you." She flinched. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Did he ever tell you he loved you?" Margaret didn't answer. I slammed my fist onto the table, making her jump. "Did he?" She wiped at her tears. "Once," she admitted. "A long time ago." A hollow laugh escaped my throat. "Of course he did." The betrayal ran even deeper than I thought. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just physical. At some point, My wife and my brother had actually convinced themselves they felt something for each other. I felt like I was going to be sick. I took a deep breath, rubbing my temples. What about now? I asked. Are you still in contact with him? Margaret shook her head quickly. No, I swear. After it ended, I avoided him as much as I could. I searched her face for any sign of a lie, but I was too exhausted to tell anymore. I turned away, running a hand through my hair. I can't do this right now. Margaret stood up, her voice panicked. Leonard, please. Don't walk away. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, now you don't want me to leave? I gestured around the room. You left me a long time ago, Margaret. You just didn't have the guts to admit it until now. She sobbed, reaching for me, but I stepped back. I need time, I said. I need space. She nodded, her whole body trembling. I'll do anything, she whispered. Just don't leave me. I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. As I stepped into the night, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just grieving my marriage anymore. I was grieving who I had been. Because the man who walked out of that house wasn't the same one who had walked in. And I had no idea what came next. I drove for hours that night. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be anywhere but there. The betrayal felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. But somewhere along the way, something changed. At first, it was anger. Then it was sadness. But eventually, something else crept in. Relief. For the first time in decades, I was free. Free from the lies, free from the doubt, free from a love that had never truly belonged to me. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to be the man who let this break him. I wasn't going to be the man who spent the rest of his life asking why. I was going to be the man who moved forward. The beginning of a new life. When I returned home, Margaret was waiting. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but I no longer felt the same anger toward her. I had made peace with something overnight. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see my wife. I saw a woman who had made choices that had consequences. I'm leaving, I told her, my voice steady. Margaret's face crumpled. Leonard, please. I held up a hand. This isn't revenge. It's not about punishing you. It's about me. She swallowed hard, nodding. Where will you go? I exhaled. Anywhere I want. For the first time in 40 years, I had the chance to live life on my terms. I packed my bags that same day. There were no fights, no drawn-out arguments. Margaret knew she had lost me, and I knew I had lost nothing worth keeping. The divorce was simple. She cried. I didn't. I walked away from our home with nothing but a suitcase and my dignity. And I never looked back. Rebuilding from the ashes. At first, it was strange. Being alone. Waking up in an unfamiliar apartment, realizing I had no one to answer to but myself. But slowly, I started to live. I took trips I had always put off. I tried new things. I met people who didn't see me as the man whose wife had betrayed him, but as someone worth knowing for who he was. I reconnected with old friends. I laughed more than I had in years. And most importantly, I forgave, not for Margaret's sake, not for James's, but for mine. Because I realized something. I had spent 40 years being a devoted husband, a loyal brother, a good man. And even though they had failed me, I had never failed myself. That was what mattered. The last chapter. One day, years later, I got a message from Margaret. She had never remarried. She wanted to meet, to talk. I smiled as I read it, but I never responded, because I had already closed that book. And my new story was just beginning. Final thought. To anyone reading this, if you've ever felt betrayed, broken, or lost, know this. You will survive. You will rebuild. And one day, you'll wake up and realize you're happier than you ever were before. Because the greatest revenge isn't anger. It's moving on. And I did.